Welcome to the Fit for Success podcast. Brian Semling is an experienced entrepreneur with over 25 years in business. He is the founder and CEO of Blitz Innovation. He has built several brands such as Brian's Toys, a collectible toy business, to several Amazon FBA brands like Strictly Bricks and Clever Creations. His latest adventure is Rovux, a modern athleisure footwear brand which can be found at rovuxfootwear.com. On the podcast, Brian will talk with other entrepreneurs and social media influencers about their entrepreneurial journey, from what it takes to start and run a business to how they may continue to grow their brands and where they see themselves in their businesses in the future. And now, here's your host, Brian Semling.
Welcome to the Fit for Success podcast. I'm Brian Semling. Today, our guest is Paige Roberts, the owner of Point Performance Neuro Training. Welcome, Paige.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So, Paige, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and your business and how you got started.
Well, I grew up in a small mountain town where there was a lot of sports going on. So really fell in love with sports and went into exercise science and then kind of got drawn into more of the sports psychology aspects of things. And that's where my passion is. And I've been pursuing this business for about 10 years now, where I really get the opportunity to help athletes in their struggle around mental health issues or any other types of addictions. And I also get to help people reach their optimal performance.
Yeah, so it sounds like you get to work with athletes, and sometimes they need help with maybe some issues that they have. Other times they're just looking for optimizing their performance. They're just needing, whatever, their A's and they want to get A pluses, and you're helping them work through some of those issues. So either way, it sounds like whether you're all sorts of athletes can come to you for assistance, basically.
Yeah, so it's the competitive mental advantage. So when we talk about like another 10%, that can be the difference between making it on the podium, making it on the team, or not.
Yep.
So when people work with us, it's really refining their fine-tuned motor skills. I use QEEG brain scans to kind of monitor what I'm doing with athletes. I use a lot of neuroscience-based modalities, and I can actually see that an athlete's audio, visual, and physical reaction time increase after they've done some of the mental aspect. So that's huge if a child is wanting to go on to college, wanting to go on to a national team, and into that professional sector.
Interesting. So you do scans, and then based on the results, you can you have different training or different programs that they go through to improve their, in essence, their brain, which helps them perform better in their sport.
Yeah, so the brain is 60 to 80% visual. So many of the techniques I utilize manipulate our visual path and strengthen those neural pathways with our eyesight. And that works off of our vestibular area of our brain, which is our kinesthetic awareness, and then obviously ties into the other three senses. So it's all really sensory based, but it starts with the eyes because they are our primary line of defense, our primary searching when an athlete is playing, essentially. And I use a lot of frequency medicine. So when we look at things like audiovisual entrainments and photobiomodulation, these are actually spectrums of light and sound that increase our overall energetic output. And then they can also get an athlete out of that fight, flight, freeze, muscle guarding, performance anxiety, sympathetic nervous system state. We knock it back down to the parasympathetic nervous system state, which is flow state. So these things have been proven to do that. There's tons of peer-reviewed articles on my website around some of this frequency medicine, and there's about 5,500 peer-reviewed studies now on the photobiomodulation. It can actually increase an athlete's sports performance by 300% when it comes to gaining muscle and gaining quicker than if you didn't utilize the photobiomodulation. Really cool stuff.
What ages are people typically, or maybe their parents, if their kids, are they coming to you to boost their, in essence, to boost their performance? I mean, is it kids? Is it high school? I know to some extent you work with all ages, but what's kind of when do people come to see you? When would you like to see them? What's kind of the sweet spot in their development?
Yeah, first and foremost, the second that an athlete gets an injury whether it be a concussion or other type of injury, we really need to work with them, because what happens is our nervous system gets ramped up into that sympathetic nervous system state, and we create a homeostasis around that. So the kid will never come out of this fight, flight, freeze, muscle guarding, not being able to utilize their fine-tuned motor skills. So that's the first reason that people would come to someone. And then the other one would be if they are trying to make it to the next level, whatever that looks like. So if you have a, elite swim club, so you have a 10-year-old that wants to get on this elite swim club, then we would do some work together. And so, I mean, it's really the whole age range there, but it is just to make it to the next level, whatever that level looks like. And then I would really say in high school, it is so very important for athletes to get this intervention of sports psychology, because they're dealing with a lot. If you're talking about an athlete, they're a high performer. So they are typically doing it all. They want to get into college, they want good grades, they have the honor society and all these other clubs. They're trying to manage school sports on top of club sports. It's a lot of stress and pressure. And so really we look at sports and exercise psychology as a way that you can prevent having to use other types of negative habitual resourcing behaviors, like say drugs and alcohol, or we have a gamut of things that we can do to kind of harm ourselves, that even like, eating disorder kind of stuff too. I see a lot of the aesthetic kinds of sports, the females end up, restricting food or cutting themselves and all these other things to kind of like take away from that pressure and to get their endorphins rushing in some way. So, I really see in high school, it's so very important if you want your child to be a high performer, want them to make it to the next level, want them to perform optimally, that you get them some sports psychology intervention to just be able to help them manage that stress, stay focused, and not kind of, utilize bad coping skills.
Yeah. It sounds like, by high school, if not possibly sooner, depending on the level of, that the athlete is at, that high school or sooner is a good time to be working with them, because the pressures of high school and then college just compound. And so if they haven't had a chance to work with somebody like you before college, it could be getting to be, they could be at risk. They could be down a path of risk and not even know it at that point, basically, right? So kind of getting ahead of that is.
And the thing about high performers is they are not your ones getting in trouble at school. They're not your ones getting in trouble per se. They're not the ones that are identified as needing services or needing to speak to a counselor.
Right.
So we kind of miss this population sometimes when we're giving intervention. And then also a lot of athletes won't ask for help, because when we're in a certain state, when our nervous system's in a state, we don't always know that we can feel better, if that makes sense. We kind of forget how we used to feel. And so a lot of times when these kids come in, they don't even realize how it feels to be less stressed. They don't even realize how it feels to be happy. Again, they've kind of gotten to this ramped up flat effect. I'm busy. I have to keep doing this. I have to keep doing this. And they have kind of lost that essence that they had like as a child, and having fun in the sport and just essentially having fun. I mean, the hardest thing for me is to see these high schoolers just so stressed out. I mean, they're like 40-year-old business person, they're so stressed. And then another aspect of things that we kind of look at here is we have an epidemic of youth suicide right now. And if we look at that, 50% of the kids who are completing suicide, they have not been diagnosed with mental illness or depression.
50%.
They weren't the ones. Yeah, 50%. So that's huge. So again, we're missing this population of these kids that are all or nothing. That's a perfectionist mentality. So they fail a test, they get yelled at by the coach. Their girlfriend breaks up with them. They're at risk of that all or nothing, that I'm bad, bad, bad. I can't go on. I've, messed things up to no return. And then they complete suicide without even telling anyone that they're struggling. So that's huge right now,
And there might not have been warning signs ahead of time because they've been doing well. So they start going on a downward path, and all of a sudden they don't know how to cope with it because they've been so used to being on an upward path. Is that the idea?
Yeah. And, and it's just really sad because these parents go, oh, I had no idea. And it's like, yeah, because your high performers aren't going to be your ones that are getting in trouble, doing all these characteristics that we would say that would be signs. And then they'll hide these things from their parents too, because again, their parents are another judge in their arena of their performance. So they won't tell their coaches, they won't tell their parents. Maybe they'll let their friends in on it. But again, they don't want to look like they're lesser than and that they can't handle it. they would rather kill themselves. And this is just, we have to start talking about these things. That's the issue. The number one cause of death of males between 10 and 24 is suicide. That's huge. Like, that's more than COVID, like, going on with kids right now. That's scary.
Right. So it should be paid attention to, and that's you and others in your profession are helping with. That is great, kind of bringing awareness to the issue.
So, and when I started formulating my business 10 years ago and really went off on my own outside of my mentor 8 years ago. And man, I was going knocking on doors, talking to all the schools, talking to sports clubs, talking to professional clubs, talking to professional owners. And I was basically getting laughed at that point in time. Like, we didn't have the trend that we have going on right now, which is amazing, with all these professional athletes talking about mental health. The NFL, all the players associations have implemented in mental health services for the high level athletes. We've got the United States Olympic Committee has a mental health registry now. We have pretty much sports psychs in every single university. That's fabulous. That was not the case 8 years ago. I mean, it was kind of
not 8 years isn't that long. So you've seen a lot of, I guess, progress in your field, basically, and just kind of how it's perceived by the public.
And the funny thing is when I first started out, getting a website together, all those types of things, I was Googling around looking for other independent sports psychs, and there are very few. And then also looking for jobs of that nature. I was just like, well, yeah, I would go work for a university. Don't they have jobs? And no, I mean, there would be like a listing of like 2, if that, a year. We have a list of like 10 just constantly flowing through that these universities are hiring, that some private sports clubs are hiring. It's amazing. So a lot of really amazing growth. However, what is still stressful on me, and when I'm working with these kids, is that in our high schools, we barely have enough counselors for, the overall population, let alone sports psychs. And then some of these private development clubs, they are charging these parents a lot of money, and they don't have the sports psych intervention. So then they still have to go outside and find that. And I can tell you right now, it's really difficult to get in with a sports psych. It's difficult to get in with a counselor at this point in time. So it seems like they're still just kind of missing space, that some of these clubs, the schools, we really need to start paying attention to this. If we're having the sports, then we need to have this aspect, just like we had to implement years ago, the athletic trainer, the physical therapy aspect of things. That was unheard of, 15 years ago. So, in youth sports, of course, college was the first college sets the precedent, and then the national sports, and then come down to smaller children. So it's kind of interesting how that all starts off and goes. And then also with that too, the concussion identification and treatment. We know that if we do not treat a concussion appropriately, especially with the small kids, they can get permanent brain damage, or they can continue to suffer from, other mental illness kinds of symptoms throughout their life. And that's really serious.
Rovox, where fashion meets fitness.
Do you have, I think you've told me about some tests or scans that you're able to do for, maybe just in general, but I think it comes to mind as you're talking about the concussions. So go ahead and just share that with us.
Yeah, we have the WAVI QEEG brain health assessment. And so it was developed at Colorado State University, or University of Colorado, sorry. No, yeah, they're rivals. You can't Anyways, so Dr. Frank Palermo, he was the Avalanche team doc for years, and he's still in the Boulder area in Colorado, but they developed this scan so that you can baseline someone's health to see what their overall voltage is, to see how much energy is flowing through the brain at any given time, as well as the communication between the areas of the brain, as well as the audio, visual, and physical reaction time. And that's called the P300. So we know how long it takes to have a stimulus, either auditory or visual, and for you to actually execute a movement. So you'll hear a ding and you're clicking the mouse. You'll see a pattern, and you have to identify as quickly as you can. So that gives us an idea of how healthy the brain is. So they developed this, and they started implementing it, and they've got quite the lengthy study going on now. I've been utilizing this tool for about 5 years now. So, and they implemented it a couple of years before that, where they're looking at the CU football players and the female soccer players. And they're really trying to show that, hey, let's baseline all of them. And then we're doing measures throughout the season. And even times that they don't have symptoms or think that they have a concussion, we have seen that the brain has been inflamed at a certain point in time when they've seen an athlete hit a soccer ball or they went down with a hard tackle. So that's giving us information that, one, I think we're going to start moving towards having more players on each team so that we can cycle them out more, especially in hockey and football. But it's showing that, you don't even have to have symptoms to have had that contre coup of the brain bouncing around the skull. So when I have someone come to me that's referred from Seattle Children's or something, they've got a concussion, the symptoms are not shifting after a month, which is 80% heal after a month and don't have any more symptoms. And so we can scan their brain to kind of see what areas of the brain are not having any communication, to see if the voltage is down. So you'll typically see like half the volts, half the amount of energy flowing through their brain because of the inflammation and lack of blood flow, and in their reaction time. So we're checking their reaction time. So again, we can actually see what's going on with the brain. And then, I really see after I see 12 sessions is kind of a sweet spot with concussions, and just even in overall health, if I see that the brain has a lower voltage and lower reaction time, that gets them back on track, right? And I have an integrative model. I do like a sports psychology, trauma reprocessing, some audiovisual entrainment, and photobiomodulation. So and then I scan the brain and we see how healthy it is, and then they're ready to go back out there. We really know that if we are treating the brain effectively, we will not potentially develop CTE. That was like the really big fear. Like when I first started my practice, that's right when the NFL was going through their litigation and all that around CTE. And we know that if we are treating it appropriately, the brain will recover. The brain is really capable of neurogenesis at any time, like all the way up until like 80 years old. But it is just, we have to address this effectively. We cannot let an athlete go back out after they've hit their head after, at least 3 days, because we know it's imminent, like brain damage if they hit their head again within those 3 days. And so there's been a lot of advancement and improvement with all of that. We've got Dr. Mickey Collins with the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. He was in that movie Concussion. Alec Baldwin played him, but he's doing some really amazing things. He's a neuropsychologist out there, and he's got a really cool integrative model with that. But the number one thing within that integrative model is sports psychology. So you have to go to a therapist, know what to expect, understand what's going on, be assessed, because when you have a concussion, you're kind of like you're drunk. You don't really know what's going on.
Right.
You'll get these individuals in here and they're talking to me. They're kind of slow. They're kind of looking around.
They're not aware of it.
They don't even realize they're doing it.
Right. So something that you've said that's encouraging is it sounds like I would have maybe tend to thought if you have a concussion, that there isn't a lot you can do other than just rest and wait for your body to heal. And it sounds like that really isn't the case, that there's a science and a, sort of a checklist, if you will, of things that you can go through, that you do go through, that lead, at least it sounds, significantly increase the chances of healing, basically, and recovering, to the point even where that long-term issue of the CT and so forth is mitigated, or just maybe even eliminated, it sounds like, or largely. So
yeah, it's awesome. So, and there's Dr. Jeffrey Kuchar. He's the head of the sports concussion wing within the American Academy of Neurology. And so they've got working with Collins and some other interesting, amazing doctors across the country. They've got some studies going on where they're showing these youth athletes. And I think there's year 7 with this study of just showing that, we don't have prolonged effects of this concussion if we're treating it appropriately right away.
Sorry to cut you off there, but that's the important takeaway here, is these can be treated. But we've got to get in to see. So someone who's got a concussion or is maybe at risk, right? Like they're a soccer, football, hockey player. Do they come to a sports psychologist? Who do they turn to for that first step of help, basically?
Well,
they're not in the emergency room in this case, right? But they want to know if they're okay or.
So yeah, and so again, in youth sports, we are not baselining them. We have the King Devics assessment also, and that was the gold standard with the Mayo Clinic, and that they're utilizing with the National Hockey League, and they still utilize with the National Hockey League. So it's just literally timing them and reading numbers on a card to see how quickly they're processing, right? So really getting a baseline is what's so important, and it is finding someone who is doing those baselining assessments and is a concussion expert. Not every sports psych is a concussion expert. So you're just really looking at those specific things if you are in a contact sport. And I know that in any sport it can happen. Like I've had swimmers hit the bottom of the pool if it was more shallow than what they're used to and they got a concussion. So, it can be any sport. And then I've had soccer players who crash skiing on a weekend ski when they're not even a, athlete of the snow sports, but they just happen to hit their head.
Right.
So it's really that. But if you look at it, we've got clinical social workers in sports. We've got, mental conditioning types of specialists. We've got sports psychology consultants, and then we have sports psychologists. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. The neuropsychologists that typically work at hospitals and some work on their own, that's where you're taking your child after about 3 months and nothing's shifting. You've tried all these other interventions. We know that there could be something else up. And so a neuropsychologist comes into play when things are pretty extreme, that they are there, and it's about a 7-hour test, and they really start looking at a lot of pieces. So that's I'll refer on if I'm not getting any results in about 3 months with someone. And there can just be some other stuff, genetic stuff, you never know with some of that going on. And that's what Dr. Mickey Collins is. And so he really started seeing more of the integrative model and how to really get people out of this post-concussion syndrome. And you mentioned like sitting in a dark room and waiting and stuff. It's so funny because he calls that the oven. You're just baking those symptoms in because your homeostasis is reset. That's your cognitive functioning. That's your vestibular. That's everything. Your reaction time. You are just literally solidifying that as your new set point. So we want to constantly be pushing to symptoms when we're integrating in these treatment modalities. And one of the more cutting edge one is vision therapy. It kind of came on the scene about 5 years ago also. I go to this Big Sky Athletic and Sports Medicine conference every year, and that's kind of where the most cutting edge things are being presented. And it's up at a ski resort the week right after the Super Bowl. And it's really these university doctors and cutting edge doctors like Kuchar and Collins presenting what they're doing and how they're really helping people before it's kind of became the gold standard. So that's where, this vision therapy has been life-changing. I had a couple concussions myself. And so I bought the software and was doing this right eye vision therapy, which it calibrates to your pupils. So you're like blowing up spaceships with your eyes, and it's actually training them. Yeah, it's really cool. And I saw that my eyes were still messed up from these concussions that I'd had when I was like 22 and 18.
Wow.
And I know. So they were just like, oh my gosh, did you just have a concussion? I'm like, no, the last one was like 9-10 years ago. So I saw that it doesn't auto correct. But when I went through the training myself, it did. It pushed me back to kind of concussion symptoms after years and years. But it was interesting because they kept saying I had astigmatism in my eyes, and nope, I just needed vision therapy for my smooth pursuit, because we know the smooth pursuit aspect of our eyes are messed up 80% of the time with a concussion. So yeah.
So and I guess the great news is it sounds like you could treat this years later, like you said, about 10 years later. Now, obviously, it'd be better to treat it sooner, but it's still treatable. And it sounds like it was about the same as if you had done it right away. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's been interesting because each time one of these things has came on the scene, I'm just doing it because I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to expand on my brain health, because that's what if anyone went and did vision therapy right now, they would expand on their brain health. And actually the right eye software is utilized in Major League Baseball. So it is one of the only ways that you can really increase your audiovisual and physical reaction time in that nature. Because again, all your senses are working together. So if you're messing with your eyes, you will increase all of your capacity for performance.
Interesting. Well, we've covered a lot of good ground today, and I know I've learned a lot. I think that our viewers and listeners have learned a lot. Is there anything that I haven't asked or covered that you'd like to add? Because there's a lot here. I know we've covered a lot of good stuff, and I want to give you a chance to.
Since I'm trying to save lives here, and I want these kids to not turn to habitual resourcing things. I don't want these kids to struggle. I want them to reach their optimal performance. If your child is having panic attacks or breaking down and crying, not sleeping well, showing self-harm or any of those things, get them in with a sports psych right away, or even just a counselor if they're not necessarily an athlete. Because just, slight intervention can really change the trajectory greatly.
Tell us how someone could find you directly as well. What is your, how might they go about getting in contact with you directly?
Yeah, so my website's www.robertsneurotraining.com. And I work all over the world essentially with athletes because we do a lot of telework. And then they can also come into my office if we're doing some more of the assessments and that kind of stuff. And I'm in Bellevue, Washington. So, yeah.
Well, very nice. So, Paige, it's been great having you on the podcast today. Thank you for your time.
Yeah,
And I'm Brian Semling. This is the Fit for Success podcast.